Guys, welcome back to this tutorial. In this tutorial, we are going to go ahead and talk about a try-catch block with multiple catch blocks. So far, what we have seen is, let's take the marker. So what we have seen is, in the examples that we have try block, and based upon what type of exception it is, we have created a catch block which basically takes a exception of either of the type generic or a particular specific type of exception, let's say DML exception or a S object exception, etc. Now, in this particular tutorial, we are going to go ahead and talk about multiple catch blocks. So what do I mean by that is, let's say you have certain pieces of code inside of the try block, and then you have also have multiple catch block. This is valid. This is okay to have multiple catch block. So if you have multiple catch block, depending upon what type of exception this particular try block is thrown, the corresponding catch block will get executed. So what do I mean by that is, if the try block is throwing an exception of the type DML, then the catch block will be handled of the type DML. So DML catch block. So if this is the DML exception catch block and this is the S object exception, if the try block is throwing the DML exception, only this particular catch block will be executed. If this try block is throwing instead of DML, if it is throwing, let's say, list exception, then in that case, if there is a catch block which is handling the list exception, this will get executed instead of the DML exception. Now, instead of having a specific exception check block, you can also have a third catch block which will handle all the exceptions. So you can have a third catch block which is generic to everything of the type exception. So let's say you have created three catch blocks. One is for the DML exception. The second catch block is, let's say, for the S object. And the third one is for the generic one, which is basically everything. Now, if this try block has thrown a DML exception, then this particular catch block will be executed, right? If this try block has thrown a S object exception, then in that case, this particular catch block will be executed. But let's say if the try block has thrown a list exception and there is no catch block to handle that, but you have this generic one, none of these will get executed. Only this particular catch block will get executed because this is for generic ones. So with one particular try block, you can have a multiple catch block. So what do I mean by that is, let's go ahead and take an example to illustrate that. I am going to go back to my developer console here. And let's go ahead and get rid of all this code. And what I'm going to do is I am creating a try catch block here. And inside of this try block, I'm writing a simple query and I'm trying to retrieve the name from the account records and the first, and I'm only interested in top one record. Limit is 1 here, and whatever the result is, I am storing in this variable of the type account. And since there's so many account records, this particular query will return only one record and will be stored in this particular variable here. You are doing another call here to get the, let's say, site. As you can see, there is a field available called site in the account object. So if you go back here to the accounts, there is a site field available in the account. So what you are trying to do is you are trying to fetch the site record. So you are trying to fetch the site from the record by writing the query. So this is going to result into an exception. So I am going to say string s. So I am going to try to fetch the site value for the account record, but this line number is going to throw an exception. I have created a catch block. Now what kind of exception it is? It is a S object exception, right? This is an S object exception, but I have created a catch block. One catch block is handling the DML exception. So I have a try block, catch block to handle the DML exception like this. And this particular catch block has inside of it system.debug DML exception occurred occurred. So here I'm going to display some message. So I will say e dot of get message, and e is nothing but this. So we can have multiple catch block for one try block. So this one is for the S object exception. And this particular inside of this catch block, like exception, and inside of this we have system.debug S object exception occurred. And here you are going to display e dot of, call this method get message, and then I also want to create a third catch block which is for the generic one. So here I'm going to say exception E. So all the other exception will be handled by this catch block. So let's say if the try block is not even throwing an exception, or it's not throwing it as a S object, and if it is throwing a list exception, in that case this particular catch block will get executed. So here I'm going to say system.debug. This one will be saying exception occurred e dot of get message. Now there is another point I wanted to mention here is the finally block. You can even have a finally block, and this particular block will get executed no matter what. Even if the exception occurred or even the exception did not occur, the finally block will execute it. So here I can say system.debug cleaning up resources in finally. So what is this doing? No matter what, this finally block will get executed. So what are we doing here is, I am trying to fetch the name from the account record, the first record, and I am storing that record into this account variable here. And then I'm trying to access the site field, this account record, but I'm not fetching that in the query. So this particular statement will result into an exception. So what kind of exception it will return? It is going to return an S object exception. So this particular catch block will be executed. Sorry, this particular catch block will get executed. The finally block will also get executed because even though the exception occurs or it doesn't occurs, this particular block of code will always get executed. So now if I go ahead and execute, let's look at the output of the program. So now if you go to the, okay, from what was line 2, okay, now go back to the execute, go to debug only, and if I have this anonymous window, so you can see here which particular catch block was executed. This catch block was executed. It says the S object exception occurred, and then it says the S object row was retrieved via SOQL without querying the requested field account site. And the finally block also got executed. So it says cleaning up the resources and finally. So this particular statement got displayed. So if I go ahead and comment this part, now in this case, nothing is wrong in the program, no exception will be thrown. So no catch block will get executed. But the finally block will still get executed. So here, if I go ahead and hit the execute button, now go to debug only, what's going to see? Only the finally block got executed because there was no statement which threw any exception. So none of the catch block got executed. Only one block got executed, which was the finally. So this is the difference between a catch block and a finally block. And you can see here, you can have multiple catch block for one particular try block. Now the order of this catch block also matters. Now what do I mean by that is, let's say you have the generic one at the bottom, right? The generic catch block is at the bottom. But if you have moved this catch block instead of the bottom, but to the top, then what will happen is all these exception will be handled by this catch block. It won't even go to this catch blocks. So let's try to execute and see if this is going to cause an error or not. So if you try to execute this program, you can see here it says exception type already caught. So you have already caught all these exceptions in this catch block. You do not even need these. So that's why it's complaining that, hey, you cannot put the major one up on the top. And if you have put it, then there is no point of putting these because all these exception will be caught here. So if you wanted to individually catch the exceptions and then whatever the remaining ones, you can put it at the bottom. You cannot put this catch block at the top. If you are trying to put it, then you cannot have anything else after the catch block. So that's why this particular thing gave you an exception. Exception type already caught. But if you move this to where it was, so if you move it back after this one, then it works fine. Because in this case, The first we have a DML exception, then you have S object, and later you have the specific. So what I am saying here is assume this particular is a bigger bucket. So any kind of exception can be handled here. So you can always have the smaller buckets at the top, and then you have the bigger bucket to handle the exception at the bottom. You cannot have the bigger at the top and then the smaller ones, because all these exceptions will be handled by the bigger bucket. So there is no point of having the smaller ones if you have already placed the bigger bucket on the top. In order to avoid this issue, you always have to specify the more specific exceptions catch blocks at the top, and then the at the bottom should be generic ones. The bigger bucket should always be at the bottom. This particular examples illustrate a lot of things. It explains you how to write try with multiple catch block, what is the purpose of the finally block, and what should be the order of the catch blocks. So let's meet in next tutorial. Till then, have a good day. Bye.